Hello, and welcome to my January TBR debrief, where I'm going to talk about all the books that I read in the month of January in 2022. And I am kind of surprised by how many that I read. So first I'll mention that I do have a January TBR video where I talked about 14 books that were on my list for this month. And I ended up reading 22 books in the month of January. So I will just say, first of all, reading has been a real coping strategy for me during this pandemic. And I think it also helps that I don't have children and I do this as my primary hobby instead of doing things like watching television. But I'm going to go ahead and run through all of the books that I read in January and just talk about each of them briefly. And then look for a February TBR video coming soon about the books I have on my list to read in the coming month. So this is actually February Eve. It is the 31st of January. I just finished the 22nd book tonight and wanted to record this video now that I have all of those books wrapped up and ready to go. So I'm actually going to reference my Goodreads list here so that I can keep track of the books that I'm talking about. And I'm going to go in the order in which I read them. So in the very beginning of the month, I actually was finishing up a book, Not a Happy Family by Sherry Lapina. And I read a few different kind of domestic thrillers in the month of January, and this was definitely one of them. This is a book about a couple that is found murdered in their home, and we're not sure if their children might have been involved in this. And they have 3 children, and they are all suspect because the children benefit from the death of the parents. And so the book kind of follows the 3 adult children as we're kind of learning about them, and they're starting to suspect each other as well. And then it kind of just unravels from there in terms of finding out who the actual killer is. I actually really enjoyed this book. I like domestic thrillers. I think they're kind of great like distractions because they're very fast paced. They usually have kind of quick short chapters. So this was one that I really enjoyed. The other book that I was reading at the beginning of the month was The Lantern Men by Ruth Galloway. This, I think, is book maybe 13, 14 in her series about Ruth Galloway, who is an amateur detective who pairs up with an actual detective in stories that span present day crimes, but also go back in time. And there's usually some kind of cold case that Ruth Galloway is helping to try and solve. This is a book that I accidentally skipped in the series. I've actually caught up beyond it, but I hadn't realized. I think I went one book beyond this. So I went back to listen to it on audio and kind of catch up in what was going on in the series. One of the things that I really love about this particular series, and it's by Ellie Griffiths, is that she does such a great job with character development. There are a lot of relationships that are happening throughout the entire series that we kind of learn about along the way. And I really have appreciated how she allows the characters to kind of grow and evolve over the course of the series. Okay, the third book that I read is Mr. Nobody by Catherine Steadman. And this book I also really enjoyed. I thought it had a great mystery at its center, which is basically the story of a man who is found on a beach and he cannot remember who he is. And a good portion of the novel is spent trying to figure out who this person is. Now, we also have a neuropsychiatrist who is treating him and trying to figure out who he is. And she feels like for some reason she kind of knows him or he knows her. And of course, she has kind of this past history that has been a secret that unfolds throughout the course of the telling of this story as well. I really enjoyed the twists and turns of this particular narrative. I definitely couldn't have chosen or picked what was going to be happening in it. And I also really love a good story where somebody has kind of a past history that is getting uncovered as you go throughout the story. And that was definitely true of the main character here. The fourth book that I read was one of the books that I picked from my own Kindle, and that was There's No Such Thing as an Easy Job by Kikuko Sumura. And this is a Japanese author that I've never read before. I had this book recommended to me from another kind of book vlogger and blogger who was interested in Japanese literature. And it was such an interesting book. I actually really enjoyed it. It was not what I was expecting. It was kind of the basic premise of it is there's a person who is going to a job placement agency, and they're looking for a job that is close to their home that is really easy for them to do, and that they can kind of just like leave at the end of the day and not have to worry about this job. And over the course of the book, I think there's 5 chapters. This person takes on 5 different jobs that are kind of pretty boring, really. I mean, think about like transcription or something like that. Like this would be kind of what falls into this category. And the jobs are always not very interesting, but the person kind of ends up getting more engaged in the job than kind of they thought they would. And then at the end of the novel, you find out kind of why this person was making this choice to pursue these kinds of jobs. I felt like, even though I haven't read a lot of Japanese fiction, the Japanese fiction I have read really was similar to what this book is. Like it's a definite kind of genre where the language is really kind of beautifully written. The plot is relatively simple in terms of what's happening, but it was clearly very symbolic of larger issues around things like capitalism, personal happiness, trying to figure out kind of your unique contribution in the world. And I also listened to this one on audio and really enjoyed it that way as well. All right. The 5th book that I picked up this month is This One Wild and Precious Life, A Hopeful Path Toward a Fractured World by Sarah Wilson. This is a nonfiction kind of memoir book. And part of the reason I picked this up out of my own Kindle pile was I've read Sarah Wilson's other book, which is First We Make the Beast Beautiful. And it's a book about her kind of struggles with anxiety and other forms of mental illness. And I loved it. I thought it was so creative and interesting. And I really had no idea what this other book was about before I picked it up, but I was willing to give it a shot because I liked her other work. This was very different than the first book of hers that I read. It's kind of almost like a manifesto on climate change. And Sarah Wilson talks a lot about kind of her own personal choices of what she's doing to try to stop climate change, both in kind of her individual actions and then like larger activism that she's engaging in. And what is kind of fascinating about this book is that Sarah Wilson has such a different lifestyle than many people lead. She's kind of a nomad, so she travels around a lot. She travels around with basically no possessions. She has like one backpack that she travels with. And I just found her lifestyle to be incredibly kind of unique and different. I will say there was some kind of political messaging in this book that for me got a little bit fatiguing. Like I felt like it was a little bit like hitting you over the head. But I did finish it because I really enjoyed kind of hearing some of the stories that Sarah Wilson was talking about. And because I always like reading stories of people who are very different than myself and who lead very different lives. And I think this definitely fell into that category. All right, so the next book that I read after that was 3 Junes by Julia Glass. This was another book that when I picked it out off of my Kindle pile, I didn't really know what it was about. I just knew that it had been recommended to me by my dissertation advisor. And she and I have very similar taste in things like detective novels and mystery novels. And this is more literary fiction. And basically the premise is the book is split into 3 parts, and they all take part in a different June in a different year. So the first part focuses on a character who's a father, and he's taking a trip, and he's kind of meeting people on this trip. And the second part of the book focuses on this man's son, and they live in different countries, and so you get kind of a bit of a different kind of cultural aspect of this as well. And then the third part of the book focuses on a woman who the father meets in the first part of the book, but in the last part of the book, she's actually meeting the son. And this is I think a really interesting story about how we kind of choose the people that we want to be in our families. We have the family that we're kind of born into, and then we have the family that maybe we choose. I thought when I was kind of talking about this book in my January TBR video that there was a kind of AIDS narrative or HIV narrative, and that is indeed the case. There is a kind of subplot, I guess you could say, if you would even call it that, but kind of a sub-narrative in this book about several men who are kind of dealing with the AIDS epidemic that's happening in the 1980s and the early 1990s. I found this book to be really beautifully written. I mean, I really enjoyed it from kind of a literary perspective. I also just found the way that the characters were engaging with each other to be incredibly believable as well. It felt like a book that was very rooted in reality, even as these characters were kind of running into each other in ways that felt, very symbolic in terms of how they were kind of coming in and out of each other's lives. So would absolutely recommend that one as well. All right. Next up, I have Such a Quiet Place by Megan Miranda. And this is a book about a neighborhood where there is a murder that happens in this neighborhood, or there are two neighbors who are killed. And there's a woman who's arrested for that murder, but then she basically is acquitted of killing anyone on a kind of a technicality, and then she comes back to this neighborhood. And all of the neighbors who are in this neighborhood don't really know what to do. And the plot kind of centers around this woman who was her roommate, and she kind of just comes and moves back into this person's house. And she doesn't know how to kind of get her to leave. And of course, all kinds of drama ensues. This is definitely kind of like a suburban domestic thriller as well. And lots of twists and turns. Definitely an interesting point in the middle of the novel that I don't want to give away any spoilers, but kind of a major event happens that changes the kind of direction of where things are going. And I really actually enjoyed that part and was kind of interested to see where things would go. I think that domestic and suburban thrillers are like, they're all a little bit similar to each other, but I find them really fun. I just, like I said, I think they're really good distractions, and they're almost like palate cleansers in between other things that I'm reading. So that one was Such a Quiet Place by Megan Miranda. Okay, after that, I read Marilla of Green Gables by Sarah McCoy. Now, this is a prequel to the Anne of Green Gables novels, if you're familiar with those. Those are young adult novels of a young orphan who joins a farm and a kind of a brother and sister who live together on this farm. They're an older generation, and this is taking place in Canada, and she kind of becomes engaged in this community of Green Gables and the larger town of Avonlea. I loved this book. I wasn't expecting to like it as much as I did. I've read the Anne of Green Gables books, several times, but it's been a little while, and I wasn't sure how I would feel about someone else kind of taking up this narrative. But you could tell that this person was incredibly respectful of the story and kind of was pulling out different aspects of the story that she thought were going to be maybe not stretching it too far, I guess. Like she definitely kind of built off one line, basically, that's in an Anne of Green Gables novel that talks about how Marilla in her childhood, people thought that her beau was Mr. Blythe, who is the father of a romantic interest of Anne in the later books. And so we end up getting like this entire story that includes a sister of Marilla and various other characters. And I just found it to be incredibly delightful. It really made me want to go back and read the Anne of Green Gables books again. So that may be something that I pick up later this year. And I would highly recommend this if you're someone who's really enjoyed these books. I will say, I feel like as a standalone, it might not have been as interesting to me. I think part of the reason I really loved it is because it felt really nostalgic, and I really enjoyed, like returning back to this concept of Anne of Green Gables. So that's something that is maybe a little bit different. Okay, so the next book that I ended up finishing was The Eye of the World by Robert Jordan. Now, I have committed to reading the Wheel of Time series this year. This is the first book in that series. I really, really liked it. I'm not sure I was like expecting that. I know my partner who loves these books was not expecting me to like it. I ended up listening to it on audio and also reading it in hard copy, kind of at the same time. I went back and forth. And basically in this first book, it's a kind of a quest narrative. You have several young people who are kind of going on a journey together, and it's a little unknown like why they're going on this journey. They have someone who's kind of traveling with them to guide them a little bit. And the main character, Rand, clearly has like some things in his past that are starting to kind of come out, like, and he's unaware of them, and he's kind of learning about them as they go through this journey. This book is very Tolkien-esque. So if you are a Tolkien fan, a Lord of the Rings fan, or a Hobbit fan, like the first part of this book, I read it and I thought, this is like almost the same start as some of the Tolkien books. But then it branches off in this like totally different direction. And my partner had kind of warned me about that. He's like, you have to keep going. Like it'll feel a little bit repetitive of Tolkien, and then you have to keep going. So this book, I think, was like maybe a little bit shy of 700 pages. I just got totally lost in the story. I can't wait to read the next one. I'm gonna put it on my TBR for February, and I'm just really excited to keep going with this story. I think it's really fun when you have a series where the author just does like a really deep dive into the narrative that they're working with. And there was a whole like world building aspect to this. There was a glossary at the back of the book that I frequently referred to just to kind of help myself understand what different elements of this magical system were. So I just thought it was really fun, and totally looking forward to reading the next one. All right, the next book that I read is called Gone for Good. It is the first book in a newer detective series of Detective Annalisa Vega, and the book is by Joanna Schaffhausen. And the general premise of this book, it's kind of focused on there's like a subplot about amateur cold case solvers, people who are not like necessarily trained as detectives, but they are coming together to try to figure out cold cases after they've been kind of abandoned by traditional police methods. And in this particular story, there's a serial killer, and there's a woman who is trying to find this serial killer, and kind of calls him out actually, and says, you know, she's coming after him basically as a cold case amateur detective. And then this woman is found dead in her home. And so you follow the detective who is trying to figure out this story. And it's also kind of got, because the cold case, the detective's father was involved in the original case when they were trying to find a serial killer who they never ended up finding. And so it kind of goes on from there. There's a whole group of people who are the like amateur detectives who are working with the woman who was murdered. And so you have a cast of characters that is that group. And then of course you're following the detective as she's trying to figure out kind of what happened here. I liked this book. I felt like it was definitely a first in a series. I would read this author again just to kind of see where she takes this. There was a bit of a twist, like most books have, that I wasn't expecting, and actually really enjoyed it. I thought it complicated things a lot, and it came kind of at the very end of this book. Won't give away any spoilers, but it made it worth it to kind of read this book. I also listened to this book on audio, and read it a little bit. I had the hard copy with me as well, and enjoyed both. So I'm really getting into a lot more audio lately, and definitely enjoyed this one in that medium. Okay. The next book I read is Hello, Transcriber, and this is by Hannah Morrissey. And I have to say, the first maybe 50 to 100 pages of this book, I wasn't on board with it. I really was having kind of a difficult time with the writing style and connecting to the main character, but then it got better over time. So the premise of this book is that you have someone who is a police transcriber who is listening to audio files of police officers when they are on scene, and she's transcribing those things to go into reports that will eventually be filed about different crimes and different kinds of engagements that police are having when they're kind of out in the community. And in this particular story, basically like a man shows up at the police station and he says that he has hidden a body, and the police are kind of trying to figure out what happened. And what's involved with this body, which is eventually found, this is not a spoiler, is that there was a drug overdose of a young child. And so then the storyline is kind of following what happened here, like, and who was involved. There's a bit of a, I guess I would just say like a dark tone to the story, because the police transcriber, who's the main character that we're following, she ends up in a kind of a relationship with a detective, and she's also writing her own kind of police novel. And so you know that she's kind of engaging with some of these things because she wants to write this novel. And I think that was kind of what was tough for me at the beginning, is that it was just kind of dark. And I'm used to dark, but dark in a way that you can still kind of connect with the main character, and I was having a hard time doing that. I ended up listening to this one on audio as well, And I would say of all the books I read this month, this is one that I found just maybe a little bit disappointing because the whole thing I wasn't kind of on board with, but I definitely felt like it was worth it in the end. So this one was kind of like a little bit hit or miss for me. I could see why people would really like it, but I could also see why some people it would be kind of a miss. All right, so another book that I squeezed in this month is a book called 100 Pep Talks by Elise Joy Kripe. This is an author that I followed for a long time. She's a crafter on Instagram. She's the creator of the Get to Work book, which is a planner that I used for several years. And I noticed on Instagram that she was on her last printing of this book, which was a book that she created out of the 100 Days Project, which is a project on Instagram where you do something for 100 days. She did 100 days of pep talks and she published it into book form. And on kind of a whim, I decided to buy the book because it was her last printing, wanted to support her work, and ended up just kind of flipping through this and reading this during the month of January as well. She accompanies these little pep talks, which were originally posted on Instagram, with some different photos. And this is definitely a book that I think I would revisit again. I'm glad I have a hard copy, especially before the printing was completed. Okay, so still more books that I read in the month of January. The next one I read is called The Hating Game by Sally Thorne. And this is a book that I read in a day because I read it as part of a readathon that I hosted as part of my online community. And I host an online community called Prolific. And this year I decided to add readathon events, and I decided to read this book for our readathon. So we had 3 2-hour sessions of reading, and I'll go ahead and post a link to the video of the readathon in the comments below because I did a vlog of that day. And this was a book that I had kind of seen around in a lot of different places because it had recently been made into an adapted like TV movie. I think it was on a streaming service or something. And I have not watched the adaptation, but definitely enjoyed the book a lot. So the general premise of this book is you have 2 individuals, a man and a woman, and they work for a publishing company, and they're basically working for rival publishing companies that merge. And so they're both the executive assistants to the head of each of these 2 companies that merge. They have to work in the same space, and they really dislike each other. And so they play all these different kinds of games, hence the title, The Hating Game, where you see these different characters kind of engaging with each other in all these different playful ways, but also, of course, over time, the tension that you see between them turns into something that's more like attraction. This is a book that I thought was so fun because it has almost every trope you can imagine from romance novels. You have a situation where they're forced to stay in the same bed when they're traveling together at one point. They attend a wedding together at one point. One of them gets really sick and the other one has to take care of them at one point. I mean, like all of the kinds of things that you see in like a typical rom-com movie or in a romance novel were all coming up here. And I thought that it was just really well plotted. I enjoyed the book. I thought it was really fun to sit down and read it all basically in one day. So I would highly recommend this one. Okay, the next book on my list is Lily and the Octopus by Stephen Rowley. And this is a book that I don't know any other way to describe it as just very fun. The general premise is you have a man who has a dog. The dog is a wiener dog, and the dog develops a tumor. And the man calls this tumor the octopus. So you have Lily, the dog, and the octopus. That's what makes up the title of the story. And this is a story of basically how this man is coping with the illness of this companion that he's had for a long time. And the kind of fun part of this book is that the dog has a voice. And I listened to this on audio, but I know that if you read this in the text, when the dog speaks, it's in all caps and there's an exclamation point after every word. So you can imagine what that sounds like on audio when the narrator is reading it. This is a relatively short book. I listened to it on audio. I did not know that it was going to have this kind of dog voice element to it when I got it on audio, but it actually was just such a fun book to engage with. I loved that component of it. And I also really loved, I think this is a book for people who are like kind of animal lovers or who have a strong relationship with a pet. But I also just thought it was a really wonderful story about a man who's kind of coming to terms with the reality that he doesn't want to have in his life. And how does he kind of work within that and For example, like naming the tumor an octopus, like he's kind of having these different coping strategies to try to make this work for him. Okay, next up I read Normal People by Sally Rooney. This is another book that recently has been adapted, I think, into like a multi-part series. And the general premise is you have two characters, a man and a woman, or girl and a boy, at least in the beginning, who are in high school, and they have a relationship that is basically kept secret. The boy doesn't want anyone to know that he is in a relationship with the girl, and then they go off to college and kind of break up, but then they run into each other at college, and the girl is become more popular, and the boy is kind of hanging on her coattails a little bit, and it kind of reverses the situation that they had in high school. This is basically a story of how these two characters weave in and out of each other's lives over several years. So each of the chapters kind of takes you forward in time. So it'll say like 6 months later, 5 weeks later, 3 days later, 6 weeks later, and every chapter is moving you forward over the course of their kind of ongoing relationship. I will say that I enjoyed this book, and I thought it was a book that many people say it's just kind of beautifully done, and I would agree with that. I certainly wouldn't be like seeking out the adaptation. I feel like I got what I needed from the book, and I'm not really interested in seeing kind of how it was adapted. That is not always true of the books that I read, but I guess I would say this is also a book that I would describe as being a little bit melancholy, and I think it's for a certain kind of mood. And I wouldn't necessarily want to continue to engage in that mood of melancholy. I wanted definitely like a pick-me-up after I read this particular book and saw kind of how it was turning out in the end. And that's not to say that it has an ending that's like bad or sad necessarily, but I just felt like it was a book that overall the tone of it was a little bit darker and a little bit more depressive. So if that's kind of something that you're going for, I would definitely pick it up. I think if that's something that is not what you need right now, I might wait until you're in a mood that makes more sense to pick up a book like that. So the next book that I picked up actually did end up being a huge pick-me-up, and I read Less by Andrew Sean Greer. Now, this is a book that won the Pulitzer Prize, and I had seen a couple other people reading it and didn't know much about it. Basically, the premise of the story is you have a gay man who his ex-partner is getting married, and he doesn't want to go to the wedding. And he happens to be an author, and so what he does is accept every invitation that he gets in the mail in like a short period of time to travel to a bunch of places internationally so he can avoid going to his ex-partner's wedding. And so you end up seeing him go to all of these different countries and have all these different experiences, and it's pretty hilarious. I mean, I think it's meant to be kind of a bit of a comedy or a satire. And I just found out in the last week or so that this author is publishing a sequel, which he hadn't really planned to do, but people just loved this character so much that he decided to do a sequel. This book was, I thought, incredibly funny. It was really charming. I could absolutely see why it won a literary prize. I would highly recommend it. I just thought it was creative, and I think it's rare to find a book that is comedic as this book was, where you have like one character who can really stand on his own. I would definitely watch an adaptation of this, and I think I would probably laugh out loud at any adaptation that was made from this book. Okay, 6 books left from my January reading. I know it's a lot, and I would say really what helped me was having the to be read pile, because I always knew what I wanted to pick up next. And as I had other books that I wanted to add as kind of extras throughout the month, I was keeping track of those as well. So this next book is one that I have actually been wanting to read for a while, but I picked up a book that I haven't finished yet, but it's called, I'll have to look it up. It's like the reader's book of, I'm gonna look it up on my Kindle right now so I can tell you what it is. A Reader's Book of Days is what it's called. And this is a book that basically goes through like dates and every day of the year, and then it gives you literary events, like fictional and non-fictional, that happen on that date. So like authors that were born on that date or died on that date, like dates that are mentioned in a novel and like what happened on that date in the novel. And it gives you books that they recommend that you read in the month of the dates that you're reading about. And one of the books that they recommended for January was a book called Airport by Arthur Haley, which I happen to have on Kindle. And so I decided to pick up this book as well. It is several hundred pages. I want to say it's like 500 or 600 pages. And basically it tells the story of a airport that is in the middle of a blizzard, kind of a winter weather event, hence why it's great to read in January. And there's also all of these other things that are happening in this airport. There's a protest that's happening. There is a bomb that is on a plane. And there's all these kind of relationships that are happening between the different people who work in this airport as well. It's kind of this little melodrama that's happening in an airport. Now, I will say this book was written in like 1969. And so the airport experience that we're reading about is completely different than what we would read about today, especially post 9/11. So for example, they talk about the concept of stowaways and how people would like trick airline workers so that they could like get on a plane and just travel from place to place, like not in the cargo hold or anything, like they would be in the actual main part of the plane. And this happened like all the time where people would just kind of like trick their way onto the plane. I can't imagine that happening now. And there are other elements that are a little bit dated, you know, but also fascinating. Like I actually really enjoyed reading about these dated elements because I just wouldn't have known kind of the back end workings of an airport or an airline or an airplane or the workers who are affiliated with any of those things. So I definitely thought it was worth it. I think you have to kind of set aside just the timing and just understand that it's going to be a little bit dated. I was completely sucked in. There was an event that happens in the book, I would say maybe 3/4 of the way through, that I was just like glued. Like I wanted to know exactly what happened. I was turning the pages. I did get this on audio in addition to reading it on Kindle. It was available in my library, and really, really enjoyed it. So would highly recommend this. This author also wrote a book called Hotel. He has various other books where he kind of talks about the inner workings of an industry. I would imagine they're probably all dated as this one, but what a fun kind of romp. And it definitely kind of an adventure story, and kind of, like I said, just like a melodrama set in this airport that I really, really enjoyed it. Okay, the next book I read was one that I picked out of my Kindle. This is Thank You for Being Late, An Optimist's Guide to Thriving in the Age of Accelerations by Thomas Friedman. I mentioned in my January TBR video, I've never read a Thomas Friedman book. I've really just encountered him through essays, and I'm aware of like The World is Flat and other things that he's worked on. And this is a book that's really having him kind of set up the idea of how technology is accelerating faster than the culture can really accept that acceleration. And so our technology in some ways is outpacing our ability to accept the changes that the technology is creating. I ended up listening to this one on audio as well. I think this one was also roughly around 500 pages. And I found that for longer books like that, especially nonfiction, audio is really helpful for me to make sure that I'm kind of progressing through it at a good pace. This was a book that I told my partner, who really enjoys like politics and history, this was more of his kind of book. I think it was really well done. I think it's just not my kind of cup of tea necessarily. I'm not sure I would have picked it up if I had known exactly what it was going to be talking about, but I'm glad I read it. And I think that it's one that is good for me to kind of have in the back of my mind. I would definitely recommend it to other people who really enjoy nonfiction in this category, which is really thinking about kind of the politics, the economics, the social impacts of some of these kinds of technology integrations that we're starting to see in our day-to-day lives. The next book that I read is called The Neighbor's Secret by L. Alison Heller. And again, another domestic thriller that I really enjoyed. This is the story of basically a bunch of women who are in a book group together, and there starts to be kind of some drama within their neighborhood. There's a vandal who is kind of destroying property, and they're trying to figure out what's going on there. All of the women, for the most part, the main characters, are having kind of issues with their children who are different ages. And then there's a woman who lives in the neighborhood who's a little bit older, and we know there's some kind of backstory about her husband who died. She has a daughter. We're not sure kind of what's going on there. And all of that kind of becomes unfurled as the story goes on. This was a great story in that I thought it had some nice twists towards the end in particular that I wasn't expecting. I really liked how each of the families within the story had their own kind of unique problems that were really complicating the plot and trying to, like keep us from understanding what was actually going on. Lots of red herrings were happening throughout this book, and I really enjoyed this one too. So I would definitely recommend it. The next book that I read is Something to Hide by Elizabeth George. Now, toward the end of 2021, I binge read 5 novels in the Elizabeth George, Inspector Lynley, and Detective Havers series. And this was because I really wanted to catch up with this series, and I think I ended up reading like 4,000 pages or something of these books, and then the new one came out in January. So of course I had to pick it up, listen to this one on audio. This is a book that it covers the story of a police officer who's found killed. And when they do the autopsy, they find out that this police officer was a victim of female genital mutilation, and she was part of kind of a community within London, which is where the book takes place, where she was kind of actively working against modern FGM. And so there's a whole kind of storyline here about FGM and how women are being affected by that, particularly women who are from Nigeria. So I would give this as kind of a trigger warning for particular forms of kind of sexual assault against women, or even sexual harm against children, because of the age at which this often happens. But I think that in terms of just the storyline of Inspector Lynley and Detective Havers and how their story is unfolding, there's some really interesting things happening kind of late in this series. And this book is the 21st book in this series, and the character development over time has just been really wonderful. There's a couple other minor characters who are starting to get a little bit more time in the series as well, which has been really fun to watch. So this book was, I think, about 700 pages, another longer one that I read this month, and really enjoyed it, listened to it on audio. And I really have liked this particular series on audio. I think the narrators do an excellent job, and it allows me to get through longer books a little bit faster when I can listen to them on audio. Okay, 2 more. The second to last book that I read this month, I just finished yesterday actually, and that is Still Life by Louise Penny. Now, I wanted to read Louise Penny's Gables series this year. There are, I think, 17 books in this series right now. And I have read Still Life before, actually a couple of times. I keep restarting this series and then not like finishing it and getting all the way through it. So I definitely wanted to start again from the beginning. And I have listened to this book on audio before. I've also read the book. This time I read the book. And I picked up on so many little details that I had completely forgotten about from previous iterations of reading it. I think the last time I read this book was probably 3 or 4 years ago. And before that, maybe 7 years before that. So it had been quite some time since I have read this book. And as you can tell, I read a high volume of books. I don't always have a good memory for what is actually happening in these books. So even with some of these ones I talked about today, I had to go back and look at the synopsis to get a quick understanding of what was it that I had actually read, because it's hard for me to keep all of the plots in my head over time. So when I start a series and then I walk away from it for a while and then I come back, I find that I have to start the series over to really make sure that I'm getting all the details, especially with one like this, where it's very focused on a particular community. There are a lot of side characters, and I wanted to make sure I was picking up on all of the nuances. So the general plot of this story is you have a small community called Three Pines, and Gables is called to this community because there is a body that's found in the woods, Jane Neal, who is a longstanding member of this community, and she has been killed. And they're trying to figure out if it was an accident, if it was a murder, and you get kind of this ensemble cast of characters who've lived in this community and have befriended each other for quite some time. And we start to see the story unfold from there. Jane Neal was an artist, and so her art is kind of brought into the storyline. There's other artists who are in this community as well. And lots of red herrings for this one also. I really do love the character of Gables. I think he's a complicated character, and I'm excited to see how his kind of relationship with other officers and with himself unfold over the course of this series. And then the last book that I read in January, which I finished today, this is my 22nd book of the month, is They Wish They Were Us by Jessica Goodman. This is a book that was the last of the 5 that I picked off of my Kindle that I wanted to read for this month. I did the alphabet challenge. All of those books started with the letter T, and so this was the one that I hadn't finished yet. This is a really fun book. It basically is set in a high school, and you have a group of students who are in a kind of elite group called the Players. And you start in the Players as first year students in high school, and then you work your way up to when you're seniors in that Players club, basically. And then you have a lot of power within the high school community. Now, in this particular book, in the freshman year of the Players who are now seniors, so several years before that, one of their group of one of the girls who's in the Players with them is killed. And so they're still several years later, even though they think they know who did it, another one of the Players, this girl's boyfriend, this is not spoilers, this is like everything that's introduced at the very beginning of the book. They think they know who did it, but there's some question about whether or not that's actually the case. And over the course of this novel, you start to see one of the characters in particular, Jill, really try to figure out what happened to her friend and to try to figure out if the person that they thought killed her friend is actually the true murderer. This book, I think, is so fun because it basically takes place in an elite high school. It was very different from my high school experience in terms of just what the characters are experiencing in this particular story. They are all basically running around with quite a bit of money. I mean, there's some scholarship students who are in this story as well, including the main character, Jill, who's trying to kind of work her way to get into a good college. But overall, I just felt like it was, it reminded me of like a show that you would watch on television that's kind of like a teen show, like a Gossip Girl or something like that, if you ever follow those kinds of television shows. And I just found it to be really fun and interesting. Definitely kind of had a sense of like where it was going in the end. I didn't feel like it was too twisty in terms of red herrings or kind of throwing you off. But it was very satisfying. I really liked how the book wrapped up. I liked the different relationships that were developed. And I definitely liked the exploration that we find from Jill of her own situation and kind of her evolution throughout the entire book as well. So those are the 22 books that I read in the month of January 2022. And I'm really excited to dive into my next month of reading. I'll be introducing my February to be read pile to you soon, and I hope you'll follow along to see what I read in this next month of the year.